Okinawa, June 1945. The air smells of ash and saltwater. Inside a concrete building near Shuri, American soldiers push through a doorway, rifles raised. The room falls silent. Along the walls, hundreds of posters stare back, vivid reds and blacks, bold kanji characters, illustrations of American ships sinking beneath waves. In the corner, 3 Japanese women stand frozen, their hands still stained with ink. One clutches a brush. Another holds a half-finished leaflet. They do not move. They do not speak. Outside, an officer barks an order. 2 privates begin tearing the posters down, crumpling them into piles. A match is struck. The paper catches quickly. Flames climb toward the ceiling, curling the edges of slogans meant to break American morale. The women watch. One bows her head. Another's jaw tightens. The third stares into the fire, her face unreadable. In that moment, something more than paper burns. It is the collapse of an empire's voice and the quiet humiliation of those who gave it sound. For decades, the role of women in Japan's war machine remained invisible to the West. While men marched to battlefields across Asia and the Pacific, women served the emperor in a different war, one fought with words, images, and voices. They were not guerrillas. They were not spies. They were propagandists. Educated, trained, and deployed to demoralize the enemy without ever holding a weapon. By 1941, Japan's military leadership understood a critical truth. Modern warfare required more than bullets and bombs. It demanded control over the mind. Psychological operations became a priority. Radio broadcasts, printed leaflets, illustrated posters, all designed to erode Allied morale, sow doubt, and amplify fear. And women, carefully selected for their voices, language skills, and cultural knowledge, became the instruments of that strategy. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy established dedicated propaganda bureaus. These offices operated in Tokyo, Shanghai, Manila, and across occupied territories. Women were recruited from universities, language schools, and prestigious families. Many spoke English fluently. Some had studied abroad. Others came from bilingual households or missionary schools. They were taught the nuances of American slang, the rhythms of jazz, the cultural touchstones that would make their messages believable. Their work was meticulous. In cramped studios, they recorded radio programs aimed at homesick GIs in the Pacific. They read scripted monologues about unfaithful wives back home, about the futility of island warfare, about Japanese invincibility. They designed leaflets dropped over Allied positions, surrender passes, fake news reports, illustrations of American casualties. They painted posters for occupied cities, blending imperial ideology with local languages and symbols. Every word, every image, every broadcast was approved by military censors. Nothing was spontaneous. Everything served the state. By 1944, these women had become essential to Japan's propaganda infrastructure. They were nameless to the Allies, but their voices echoed across the Pacific. American troops dubbed them collectively as Tokyo Rose, though no single woman held that name. They were ghosts on the airwaves, familiar, unsettling, and everywhere. But by the spring of 1945, the war had turned irreversibly against Japan. The island-hopping campaign brought American forces closer to the Japanese mainland with each passing month. Saipan fell in July 1944. The Philippines were liberated by March 1945. Iwo Jima was taken in brutal combat that same month. And on April 1, 1945, American forces landed on Okinawa, the doorstep of the Japanese home islands. As territory collapsed, so too did Japan's propaganda network. Radio stations went silent. Printing presses were abandoned. Studios were evacuated in haste, leaving behind reels of recordings, stacks of posters, and half-finished scripts. In Manila, American troops discovered entire floors dedicated to psychological warfare, desks cluttered with English-language newspapers, propaganda drafts, and photographs of Allied casualties. In occupied Chinese cities, retreating Japanese forces left behind warehouses full of leaflets destined for distribution across Southeast Asia. And then there were the people. As facilities were overrun, American soldiers encountered the propagandists themselves. Many were men officers, writers, translators. But a surprising number were women. Young, educated, often dressed in modest civilian clothing or military auxiliary uniforms. They did not carry weapons. They did not resist. When confronted, most simply stopped working and waited. Some burned documents before capture. Others left everything intact, too exhausted or resigned to destroy what they had spent years creating. The discovery shocked many American servicemen. They had heard Tokyo Rose on the radio. They had found her leaflets in foxholes. But they had imagined her as a singular figure, perhaps a collaborator, a traitor, or a mythical construct. To find multiple women working in organized units, producing propaganda with bureaucratic efficiency, was disorienting. These were not the fanatical soldiers they had faced on Peleliu or Tarawa. These were clerks, artists, broadcasters, women who had waged war with ink and microphones. And now they were prisoners. The question became, what to do with them and with the materials they had created. Orders came down quickly. Propaganda was to be confiscated, catalogued, and in many cases, destroyed. Intelligence officers wanted samples for analysis. But the bulk of it, the posters, the leaflets, the recordings, was deemed dangerous. Even in defeat, it carried the power to mislead, to provoke, to remind occupied populations of imperial ideology. So it was burned. Who were these women before the war made them propagandists? Most came from middle-class or elite families. They had attended girls' schools where English was taught alongside traditional subjects. Some had grown up in cosmopolitan neighborhoods of Tokyo or Yokohama, exposed to Western music, literature, and fashion before nationalism tightened its grip. They were daughters of professors, merchants, low-ranking officials. A few had harbored dreams of becoming teachers or journalists. None had imagined spending the war in a windowless studio, reading scripts about American defeat. Recruitment often came through official channels. University administrators identified promising students. Family connections opened doors to government bureaus. Some women volunteered, motivated by patriotic duty or economic necessity. Salaries were modest but stable. The work was safer than factory labor or nursing near the front lines. And for those fluent in English, it offered a rare opportunity to use their education in service of the nation. Their daily routines were rigid. Mornings began with script review. Censors marked passages, corrected tone, adjusted propaganda angles based on intercepted Allied communications. Women rehearsed pronunciations, smoothed accents, and practiced emotional inflections, sounding sympathetic one moment, mocking the next. Recording sessions lasted hours. Between takes, they drank tea, fixed their hair, and waited for approval. The work was tedious, isolating, and relentless. Few knew the names of their colleagues. Security protocols discouraged friendships. They were tools of the state, not individuals. The materials they produced were designed with precision. Leaflets featured surrender passes written in English, promising humane treatment and hot meals. Posters depicted American sailors drowning in flaming oil, their ships split apart by torpedoes. Radio broadcasts mixed jazz music with scripted messages, a seductive voice lamenting the loneliness of Pacific service, suggesting that loved ones back home had moved on. Every element was calculated to exploit fear, homesickness, and doubt. Distribution networks stretched across the Pacific. Leaflets were dropped from aircraft over Allied positions. Posters were pasted in occupied cities where American POWs might see them. Radio transmissions reached soldiers on remote islands, cutting through static in the dark hours before dawn. The goal was omnipresence, to make every American serviceman feel surrounded not just by enemy forces, but by enemy voices whispering directly into their thoughts. The effectiveness remains debated. Most Allied troops dismissed Tokyo Rose as entertainment, a strange curiosity rather than a genuine threat. But intelligence reports noted instances where propaganda leaflets were collected, discussed, and occasionally kept. A few defections occurred. More commonly, the materials simply lingered in the psychological landscape of the war, another layer of dread in an already brutal campaign. When American soldiers first encountered these women, the cognitive dissonance was profound. The Pacific War had been defined by brutal combat against an enemy portrayed as monolithic and fanatical. Japanese soldiers fought to the death. Civilians on Saipan jumped from cliffs rather than surrender. The propaganda had promised the same unyielding resistance everywhere. But here were women in neat blouses and skirts, sitting at typewriters, surrounded by English dictionaries and American magazines. They looked more like office workers than enemies. Some soldiers reacted with confusion, others with anger. A few expressed something closer to pity. These women had not fired a shot, yet they had been complicit in a campaign designed to break American spirits. Interrogators struggled to classify them. Were they combatants? Civilians? War criminals? The Geneva Conventions offered no clear guidance for psychological warfare operatives. Most were eventually designated as civilian internees, a bureaucratic category that acknowledged their role without fully defining it. The women themselves varied in their responses. Some remained defiant, insisting they had only followed orders and served their country honorably. Others expressed shame, recognizing that defeat had rendered their efforts futile and humiliating. A few refused to speak at all, maintaining silence as a final act of resistance. The cultural gulf was immense. To American soldiers raised on ideals of individual freedom, the notion of educated women dedicating themselves to state propaganda seemed incomprehensible. To the women, raised in a culture that prized collective duty and filial loyalty, their service had been entirely natural. The decision to destroy propaganda materials was both practical and symbolic. Commanders feared that leaving posters and leaflets intact could allow remnants of imperial ideology to persist in occupied territories. Local populations, already traumatized and disoriented, might interpret preserved propaganda as evidence that Japan's defeat was temporary or incomplete. Allied psychological operations aimed to demonstrate total victory, and that meant erasing the enemy's voice entirely. But the act of burning carried deeper meanings. For American troops, it was a reversal of the psychological warfare they had endured. Every poster consumed by flames was a small victory over the voices that had followed them across the Pacific. It was cathartic, a ritual purging of manipulation and lies. Orders were orders, but many soldiers approached the task with satisfaction. For the Japanese women forced to witness it, the experience was devastating. These materials represented months or years of their labor. They had poured skill, intellect, and obedience into every design and script. To watch it burn was to see their contribution to the war effort reduced to ash and smoke. It was public humiliation, not through violence or abuse, but through negation. Their work, their voices, their purpose all declared worthless in an instant. Some women stood in silence, faces blank with shock. Others wept quietly, unable to look away. A few turned their backs, refusing to witness the destruction. The flames reflected in their eyes, and in those moments, the war's psychological dimension completed its final, cruel reversal. The propagandists became the propagandized, forced to absorb the message written in fire: your empire has fallen, and your words mean nothing. The largest and most documented incident occurred on Okinawa in mid-June 1945. American forces had been fighting for over 2 months to secure the island, facing fierce resistance from Japanese defenders entrenched in caves and fortifications. As combat shifted southward toward the final pockets of resistance, infantry units began clearing administrative buildings and military installations in captured areas. One such building, a nondescript 2-story concrete structure near the town of Shuri, had been identified by intelligence as a regional propaganda headquarters. On June 14, elements of the 96th Infantry Division approached the building cautiously. Resistance had been sporadic in the area, but booby traps were common. Sergeant James Holloway and his squad pushed through the entrance, weapons ready. The ground floor was empty except for overturned furniture and scattered papers. But on the second floor, they found the studio. Equipment lined the walls: microphones, recording devices, typewriters, lithography machines. And covering every available surface were the materials: stacks of leaflets bundled with twine, rolled posters leaning against corners, printed surrender passes in English still smelling of fresh ink. 3 Japanese women stood near the back window. They wore simple civilian dresses, their hair pinned back. None appeared older than 30. One held a paintbrush, its bristles still wet with red ink. Another clutched a folder against her chest. The third stood with her hands at her sides, perfectly still. None attempted to flee or resist. When Holloway called for them to step forward, they moved slowly, eyes downcast, stopping a respectful distance away. An interpreter was summoned. Through him, the women identified themselves as civilian employees of the Imperial Army's Information Bureau. They had been producing propaganda materials for distribution across the Pacific Theater. When asked if they understood they were now prisoners, all 3 nodded. The folder the second woman had been holding slipped from her fingers, spilling sketches across the floor, half-finished designs for leaflets depicting American bomber crews as murderers of Japanese children. Captain Robert Finch arrived within the hour. He surveyed the room, flipping through stacks of materials, examining posters depicting American defeat. His orders were explicit: confiscate samples for intelligence analysis, then destroy the rest. The women were to be detained and transported to a processing center for civilian internees. He assigned 2 soldiers to guard them and instructed Holloway's squad to begin removal of the materials. The women were made to sit on wooden chairs near the wall as soldiers worked. They watched in silence as armfuls of posters were carried downstairs. Boxes of leaflets followed. Recording reels were stacked in crates. The process took nearly an hour. Outside, a clearing was designated. Soldiers dumped the materials in a pile, arranging them loosely to catch fire easily. Captain Finch ordered the women brought outside. They descended the stairs slowly, flanked by guards. The tropical sun was fierce, reflecting off white coral dust. The pile of propaganda materials sat 10 yards away, a chaotic mound of colored paper and rolled canvas. Finch positioned the women where they could see clearly. He did not explain why. Perhaps he believed they needed to understand the finality of Japan's defeat. Perhaps it was simply procedure, ensuring prisoners witnessed the destruction of military assets. Or perhaps, beneath the veneer of duty, there was an element of retribution. These voices had followed American troops across the Pacific. Now they would watch their words burn. A private doused the pile with gasoline from a jerry can. The liquid darkened the paper, spreading in irregular patterns. Another soldier struck a match and tossed it. The flames erupted instantly, a wall of orange and black smoke climbing into the humid air. The heat was immediate and intense, forcing nearby soldiers to step back. The fire consumed the materials with violent efficiency. Posters curled and blackened. Leaflets disintegrated into floating embers. The kanji characters twisted and vanished as if they had never existed. The youngest of the three women made a sound, not quite a gasp, more like air escaping. Her hands moved to her mouth, then dropped to her sides. Beside her, the woman with the paintbrush stared into the flames without blinking, her expression frozen somewhere between shock and resignation. The third woman closed her eyes. Her lips moved silently, perhaps a prayer, perhaps simply counting breaths until the moment passed. One of the American soldiers, a corporal from Ohio named Daniel Kemp, watched the women more than the fire. Later, in a letter home, he would write about the discomfort he felt. These were not combatants. They had not killed anyone. Yet standing there, forced to witness the destruction of their work, they seemed more defeated than many Japanese soldiers he had encountered. Their humiliation was quiet, internal, and complete. He described it as watching someone's identity being erased in real time. The fire burned for 20 minutes. As the flames diminished, Captain Finch gave a curt nod. The women were led away toward a transport vehicle. None of them looked back at the smoldering remains. The youngest stumbled once, caught herself, and continued walking. Her face was streaked with tears she had not bothered to wipe away. The woman with the paintbrush maintained her rigid posture, jaw clenched, refusing to show any emotion to her captors. The third kept her eyes fixed on the ground, her steps mechanical. Similar scenes unfolded across the Pacific in those final months. In Manila, American forces discovered a propaganda printing facility operated by a dozen women and burned thousands of anti-American pamphlets in the street while the staff watched from a guarded room. On Guam, Marines found a radio transmission station where two female broadcasters had recorded their final program just hours before capture. Their scripts were thrown into an oil drum and set ablaze outside the building. In Tokyo itself, after surrender in August, occupation forces systematically dismantled the main propaganda bureaus, incinerating materials by the truckload while Japanese staff stood at attention, bearing witness to the end of their empire's psychological war. The burnings were never officially documented as acts of humiliation. Military reports described them as standard destruction of enemy propaganda assets. But for the women who had created those materials, who had spent years crafting messages, perfecting accents, designing images meant to demoralize an enemy, the experience was far more personal. It was the erasure of their contribution, their relevance, and in a culture that prized collective achievement in service to the emperor, it was the public declaration that their efforts had been meaningless. The women captured on Okinawa and across the Pacific were processed through military detention systems designed primarily for male combatants. Classification proved complicated. They were not soldiers, yet their work had directly supported military operations. They were not prisoners of war under strict definitions, yet they could not simply be released. Most were eventually categorized as civilian internees and transported to larger holding facilities where conditions ranged from austere to tolerable. Interrogations followed. American intelligence officers were intensely interested in the structure and methods of Japan's propaganda apparatus. The women were questioned about command hierarchies, approval processes, distribution networks, and the psychological strategies behind specific campaigns. Some cooperated fully, providing detailed accounts in exchange for better treatment or promises of eventual release. Others offered only minimal information, citing loyalty or claiming ignorance of broader operations. A few refused to speak at all. What surprised interrogators most was the sophistication of the operation. These women had not been amateur volunteers. They had received training in psychological warfare techniques, studied American culture through captured magazines and films, and worked within a highly organized bureaucratic system. Notes from interrogation sessions reveal that several women could quote American baseball statistics, name popular radio shows, and discuss Hollywood gossip, all tools used to make their propaganda broadcasts more credible and psychologically penetrating. Treatment of female internees varied by location and commanding officer. Some facilities separated women entirely, housing them in converted schools or administrative buildings. Others placed them in sections of larger camps with minimal contact with male prisoners. Rations were basic but adequate. Medical care was provided. Physical abuse was rare, though the psychological weight of captivity, uncertainty, and the shame of defeat took its toll. Several women fell into depression. Others formed quiet support networks, rarely speaking but finding comfort in shared silence. As the occupation of Japan solidified through late 1945 and into 1946, decisions had to be made about the fate of propaganda operatives. War crimes trials focused primarily on military leaders, government officials, and those directly responsible for atrocities. The women who had worked in psychological warfare occupied a gray area. Their contributions had been real, but proving criminal intent was difficult. Most had followed orders within a legal framework that existed at the time, however morally questionable. The majority were released within months of Japan's surrender. They returned to a country devastated by firebombing, atomic weapons, and economic collapse. Families had been displaced. Cities lay in ruins. The social order had fractured. For these women, reintegration was deeply painful. The shame of defeat permeated Japanese society, but for those who had actively promoted the war effort, it carried an additional weight. Many never spoke publicly about their roles. They found work in factories, shops, or offices, their wartime service buried in silence. A few faced harsher consequences. Iva Taguri, an American citizen of Japanese descent who had been coerced into broadcasting as Tokyo Rose, was arrested in 1945 and eventually tried for treason in the United States. Her trial became a political spectacle. In 1949, she was convicted on questionable evidence and served 6 years in prison before being released. She spent decades fighting to clear her name, finally receiving a presidential pardon from Gerald Ford in 1977. Her case highlighted the selective and often arbitrary nature of justice applied to propaganda operatives. Other women disappeared from historical record entirely. No comprehensive list of female propaganda workers was ever compiled. Japanese government archives were incomplete or destroyed. American military records focused on operational details rather than individual identities. The women became footnotes, if they were mentioned at all, nameless participants in a psychological war that history chose largely to forget. The propaganda materials themselves met different fates. Intelligence samples were archived in military libraries and research institutions. Historians and psychologists later studied them as examples of wartime psychological operations. But the vast majority was destroyed as planned. Tons of leaflets, posters, and recordings were incinerated, buried, or dumped at sea. What survived exists in fragments, a few posters in museum collections, declassified recordings in archives, scattered leaflets preserved by soldiers as souvenirs. The voices that once saturated the Pacific airwaves faded into static and silence. The burnings themselves were rarely mentioned in official histories. They were procedural, unremarkable to military chroniclers focused on combat operations and strategic outcomes. But for the women who witnessed them, the memory endured. In rare post-war interviews conducted decades later, some described that moment as the true end of the war, not the Emperor's surrender broadcast, not the signing aboard the USS Missouri, but the sight of their work reduced to ash while American soldiers stood watch. It was personal defeat made visible, irreversible, and absolute. War humiliates in ways that extend far beyond the battlefield. It strips dignity not only through violence but through erasure, the deliberate negation of effort, purpose, and identity. For the Japanese women who created propaganda, their humiliation was not found in captivity or interrogation. It was in watching flames consume the only contribution their society had allowed them to make. They had been told their voices mattered, that their words could wound the enemy as surely as bullets. And then, in a single afternoon, they learned the truth: in defeat, words become smoke. History remembers the soldiers, the generals, the cities destroyed and rebuilt. It rarely remembers the propagandists, especially the women. They were neither victims nor villains in the traditional sense, but something more complicated. Instruments of a system that used their intelligence and loyalty, then discarded them when that system collapsed. The fires that burned their posters were not acts of cruelty. They were acts of erasure. And erasure, quiet and complete, leaves scars that never quite heal. Okinawa is peaceful now. The concrete building near Shuri still stands, repurposed and anonymous. No plaque marks what happened there. The women who stood in that clearing are gone, their names lost to time. But the ash of their words once drifted over the Pacific, carried by the same winds that carried the voices they had crafted with such care. In the end, both the voices and the ash scattered into silence, a war fought with paper and fire, remembered by no one, forgotten by design.